Okay, welcome back for panel number 3, which is absolutely not below panel 1 or 2. In fact, this is my heart is in this panel because it's in my mind it's financial services, which is where I've spent the last X number of years. So let me just set the setting for this here, and it's a little different than the prior 2 panels because there's no porn, there's no bullying, none of these things. It's just data. There's a California law was enacted in October 23 that has put a spotlight on potential restrictions on data brokers' ability to assemble and sell information on individuals. I might say the interesting thing about that is when you get to identity verification, I'm not sure how without data brokers you really can reasonably try to get to some sort of identity verification. So there's something, and Chris, you may want to comment on that at some point. Under the new law, California residents will ultimately be able, as I understand it, to click a single online delete button that would direct all covered data brokers to delete information regarding an individual who takes such action. Information about the individuals obtained from data brokers plays a large role in how the internet ecosphere functions, and widespread opt-outs could broadly impact current industry operations. This development could lead to further similar state actions or state or federal action of some type. And we're also going to be discussing more broad privacy issues that are popping up quite actively right now at the federal level. We have a terrific expert panel today. Online, online we have Alyssa Hutnick, who's a partner at Kelly Dry in D.C. Chris is sitting immediately next to me. He's an executive vice president at the Association of National Advertisers. One seat further over, Michael Signorelli is a partner at Venable, and Haley Tsukiyama is the associate director of legislative activism at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who is joining us from San Francisco. So we are very, very pleased to have such a knowledgeable panel. And following our last round of things here, we're going to start with Haley, and then Alyssa, Carl, and Mike with your opening 4-minute statements. Haley?
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me, and I apologize that I couldn't be there in person today. But as said, I'm Haley Tsukiyama. I'm from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. EFF is a nonprofit devoted to protecting digital civil liberties, including privacy. I work primarily on state legislation and then also co-lead our thinking around the broader issue of consumer privacy. Just quickly, EFF centers its consumer privacy work around placing individual control at the center of privacy. So when we're thinking about data brokers are particularly difficult for the average person to wrap their head around. These are companies that collect and sell personal information that they've amassed on individuals with very, in my opinion, little oversight. In some cases, they can provide broad information for companies to gain insight into demographics such as income and age. They also can collect more specific information, sensitive information such as buying habits, financial records, social media activity, or precise geolocation information. Potential misuse of location information or things like health information could lead to real harms, harassment, discrimination, and legal consequences for those seeking, for example, particular health services. And they can also lead to scams, identity theft, and financial exploitation if you are just from the collection and misuse of personal information. As I said, EFF is very individual-centered. We believe you have a right to know who has access to your information, and we deserve transparency on when our most private moments are being shared and sold by third parties. So for that reason, we were happy to support the Delete Act in California because it allows people to easily and efficiently make one request to delete their personal information held by all data brokers registered in the state of California. The implementation of that lies in the hands of the California Privacy Protection Agency, which has both technical and policy expertise. We think to do this right, that, as I will get into later, may not be the case in everywhere where these bills are introduced, but we think in California it was a good spot. And most of all, it provides an option for everyone to exert a little more control over their privacy. Obviously, you don't have to hit the button. You only hit the button if you want to hit the button. Overall, it makes California's consumer privacy laws much more user-friendly, which is a thing that I have a lot of concerns about. I think we've seen a tremendous amount of uptick in privacy legislation in the past several years, but not all of it is actually that easy for individual people to use. It places a lot of burden on individuals to manage their own privacy. It could be its own job managing your privacy and continuing to figure out who has your information. And so we just want to make, we supported this because we wanted it to make it just that much easier for people to express their choices if they want to. So I'll stop there. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Haley. So I think I'm next. I'm Elisa Hutnick. I chair Kelly Dry's privacy practice group. And the perspective I bring to the topic today, I work with a lot of companies in helping them address their compliance and really thinking about how they will comply, for example, with the California's Delete Act. And then I defend companies in investigations by state attorney generals like the California Attorney General, which certainly informs how we are interpreting and implementing compliance with these laws, as well as the FTC, which is kind of bringing other developments in terms of privacy enforcement and informing how we interpret and implement the kind of holistically privacy laws. And I think when we consider where we are today with the California Delete Act and what we might see in the future in terms of the rules and the implementation and building of California Delete Act, I think it's really important to level set on kind of this moment in time, because privacy for so long was just part of broad consumer protection, unfair and deceptive trade practices. A lot of it was best practices, for example, when it came to digital advertising and online profiling. And so in a relatively short period of time, we had California's CCPA. And then since then, it's been like we're off to the races. It is a dizzying pace of new state omnibus laws that are being enacted. And then certain specific types of laws focus on data brokers, focus on health data, focus on precise geolocation information. And so all of these different new laws are happening. Companies really kind of from a data strategy and a data management and a data governance. It used to be kind of have, again, good intentions, build a program that's reasonable. And we got to a very granular place really fast, where compliance is not just good intentions, but from A to B to Z, you really need to be able to manage that data properly, including deletion. And so I kind of see us at this phase of we are in the crawl phase, not at the walk and not at the run phase. And consumer expectations, business expectations, how do we align and meet in the middle? I think it's going to be clunky for quite some time. And so that is maybe just the reality of it. I think consumer expectations are high, are very aware now of consumer privacy, given all of the news coverage, and it's the moment. It's fairly viral where you'll have a privacy related story and it catches a lot more attention today than I'd say maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So I think there's consumer demand for the type of transparency and user-friendly options that Haley mentioned. And I think there are business reasons, not just compliance reasons, not just fear of risk, that companies are trying to meet them there. And we're all on this journey together in terms of what is that right balance, that right execution of these. And it's from a lawyer perspective, from a policy perspective, it's a really, really interesting time to be in the privacy space. So I look forward to the discussion and hearing from my co-panelists.
Thanks, Alyssa. Carl.
I got it. Okay. Thank you, Bob. And thank you, Professor. Thank you, George Mason, for hosting us. My name's Chris Oswald. I'm the Executive Vice President and head of the Law, Ethics, and Government Relations Department for the Association of National Advertisers. The ANA is the country's oldest and largest advertising trade association. We were founded back in 1910. And presently, we have about 1,600 member companies representing over 20,000 brands. And I'll preface my remarks by kind of dovetailing off of our previous session that talked about previous sessions talking about the internet. And while Al Gore may have invented the internet, the internet was underwritten and continues to be underwritten by advertising. And modern day data-driven advertising brings a lot of benefits to our society, to our economy, certainly to jobs in this country. It is a significantly big industry. And at the core of modern day advertising and advertisers is the responsible use of data. An advertiser's job is to respect its customer and its potential customer. And to do that is to identify what a potential customer would be interested in using data responsibly, and to deliver messages about the right service or the right product to that right consumer through the right channel at the right time. And that's what advertising in the modern day is all about. And again, data is at the center of it, and the responsible use of data is super important to deliver that message. And again, the concomitant benefits just happens to support a lot of content on the internet. But when we talk about data, we talk about privacy implications. And certainly in the last, decade and a half, we have seen many pieces of legislation and proposals in states throughout the country, and certainly here in Washington, D.C., where the notion of the use of data and personal privacy collide. And what we're seeing going back to 1999, 2000 are laws restricting the use of data, and certainly that impacts our industry, the advertising and marketing industry. And it is one of those things that, as an industry, and A&A in particular, takes seriously our advertisers and our members' responsibility to the public. And as such, we have been spearheading, and we founded a number of self-regulatory programs. One in particular is the Digital Advertising Alliance, which allows for individuals to opt out of targeted advertising. We can talk a little bit more about that. But there's certainly, we're at a point right now in our country's history where we are seeing proposals like the Delete My Data Act in California that passed, and other proposals throughout the country that we think will have significant impacts, not all of them good, for Americans within our country. And my job as an advocate for the industry is to highlight for law and policymakers those unintended consequences, and to make sure that we can mitigate them before we go off and pass laws that not only negatively impact our industry, but could negatively impact Americans themselves.
Chris, thank you very much. Mike.
Thank you. Appreciate the invitation to participate in this dialogue. I'm Mike Signorelli. I'm the co-chair of the Technology and Innovation Group at Venable, where I practice data privacy. For the past 20 years, I've been engaged in every major data privacy debate before Congress, at the federal agencies, of late, the last 5-6 years, across all the states. Working closely with Chris, I'm outside counsel, policy counsel of the Association of National Advertisers. I represent the broader advertising industry. I represent two of the largest data brokers in this country, so I'm well versed in these issues and quite passionate about access and the use of data and making sure it's being done in a reasonable way. There was a reference to industry codes of conduct with the ANA. Myself and some people at Venable drafted the industry codes of conduct, the Digital Advertising Alliance. So understanding how to strike consumer controlled, making sure that data is available to fund the internet, make sure that all those products and services are available, but done in a way where consumers have appropriate control, transparency over that use of data, as well as defending clients before the Federal Trade Commission and with the California AG under investigations under the CCPA. So certainly looking forward to sharing that experience on the policy compliance side of things, as well as the investigation front. But on the topic of the Delete Act and data brokers, my sense is that there's a fundamental misunderstanding about the role of data brokers and what they actually mean to society and the economy. I'm not suggesting that they're mother superior in any way, but they are the fuel, they are the touch point for our economy to ensure that it operates. Yes, they help small businesses compete. They help small businesses to find new markets and new customers. They ensure that every online transaction is secure. They are the companies that help fight against scams and fraud. And a lot of proposals that we're seeing, including the Delete Act and some legislation before Congress, does not appropriately balance the need for data broker services to ensure that our country can remain secure from criminal activity, terrorism, to make sure our financial transactions are secure, that there's competition. And yes, they help support advertising and marketing, and they should, subject to an opt-out and appropriate controls. But there are certain uses of data by data brokers that are so essential to the functioning of our daily lives that there must be exceptions, which the Delete Act and federal legislation doesn't appropriately provide for. I'm sure we'll examine that in our conversation.
That's one kind of background question. Is there a commonly accepted or legal definition for what a data broker is, or does anyone have one?
I thought there was. I thought that it had been generally understood to be a commercial entity that collects data from a source other than a direct relationship with the consumer. That had been a general standard developing across the country that we've seen in legislation. Again, there's not a direct consumer relationship where the data is being collected. Those are the touch points in the definition. But recently, the California Privacy Protection Agency introduced draft regulations where they would define that direct relationship in a way where first parties, where they do have a direct consumer relationship but gather data from another source, also could be a data broker. So I don't know if it's yet set. I think we're seeing it evolve already, and rather from October to now May, a big shift.
Mike, I want to say your description of the issue is exactly why we wanted to have this panel, because I think this is extremely opaque, and I think if we walked out on the street in Arlington and asked people to tell us what data brokers do or whether they're good or bad, they would have no idea. And we appreciate all you guys being here to hear this, and those of you online as well. Alyssa, we got a big, wide question here for you. What are the legal developments you see that are shaping how companies approach their data protection responsibilities here in 2024?
So if there's a theme, I think it's upskilling. I mean, we went, just being very practical, we went from best practices and general concepts to very granular requirements. And so there is one thing to read a whole, pages and pages of statutes and regulations. It's another to operationalize that. And so one of the things that I have seen, and this is where the needle has just really moved, it's usually you have it in companies, it's an in-house counsel, maybe 2, maybe 3, sometimes it's a team, if they're lucky and they have a lot of resources. And really walking through, well, what is personal information? And the obvious buckets of personal information are one thing, but so much of the discussion ends up being around what we call pseudonymous data or hash data that allows matching and allows targeted advertising, for example. And so the fact that there are these requirements and the fact that they are being enforced has pushed more questions of the business, and not simply, we don't deal with personal data, but really getting at a very granular level as to how do certain business practices work? What kind of data is being used? What are the purposes for that? And I think while lawyers were curious by nature and we ask a lot of questions, I think the imperative of trying to make sure that the company has a compliant program and that they understand what that compliance means has just led to so many more questions, really from a soup to nuts, about data practices within the company. And like, you think of your term papers, your first draft, maybe you wouldn't want too many people to read it. And the refinement that happens, the more times you go through it and the more insights you have. And then we start seeing state AGs enforce and be very clear about certain practices that this is their interpretation in terms of what they view to be in scope or what is not considered to be sufficient compliance. Haley's point on it's not consumer friendly. And I think about all of the kind of the first round of modules to exercise your privacy rights and the language and just the functionality on it. We are already seeing those evolve and look a lot more user friendly in a lot of contexts. So upskill in terms of knowledge. And as you learn more, you ask more, including for resources. You think about business budgets and that gets set a year in advance that don't really account for how do you make sure you have the right resources to, some of this is a lot of new software, it's people, it's accountability measures, and that takes time and resources and making sure you've got it in the right places. You're asking for the right resources that you can deploy in the right places. And so I think that needle just continues to move. And as we have more enforcement, that tends to light a fire, as we have the Wall Street Journal and other, New York Times doing really broad coverage on certain data practices in particular, that gets the board's attention of companies. And then you get the really imperative from the top down as to what are we doing and is it enough? So I just see a lot of these currents pushing in one direction and expect to see quite a bit more of that going forward, similar to what we saw with cybersecurity, quite honestly.
Thank you, Alyssa. Before we move on to Haley, do you have a related comment on data protection responsibilities and machine learning and AI?
Oh, the twin concept of AI, the popular one. I will just say as an aside, I think the privacy lawyers get all of the misfit toys legal issues because often they work with so many different stakeholders within the company and have a pretty good sense of how things work. So you get the messy issue of AI. I think where I'm seeing AI so much goes to data use. Sometimes it's not personal data, but a lot of times it is, depending on the context. And to comply with privacy laws, you have to know, again, for example, what is personal information going in? What would you have to do if you had to remedy certain things, or the output and the models? And can you get a model off the shelf? What happens to the data that is then further training the model? So I think the privacy stakeholder is so important and has been really providing a lot of, I think, good commentary on where to strike that balance. But we're even, forget the crawl phase, we're like way early in terms of where is the right policy outcome. California, for example, with their draft regulations, they're very much an early stage without consensus, even in terms of what is enough. And so I think we're in early days. I think you can't talk about AI without talking about interest-based advertising, because that's usually just one of the first really big buckets in terms of how AI brands are using to make sure that they understand their customer base and their prospects and who they want to reach. So interesting times, more regulation, fear of more regulation in terms of hindering innovation and having the US be behind other countries. So I think it's a very active policy debate.
Thank you, Alyssa. Haley, are there harms or potential harms? And if so, what are they that consumers might face from an unregulated data broker industry?
Yeah, happy to answer that. I will say, if it makes you feel any better, Alyssa, AI also, privacy advocates also become we get the misfits. So I'm also just trying to read up on that. So really appreciated your comments. So when we're talking about harms, so first I want to say, I understand, not by any stretch of the imagination is every data broker behaving in the ways that I'm gonna offer some examples of harms that we've seen. I totally understand it's a big industry. Not every company that gathers data for profiles has the same aims or approach to how they practice. But we have seen some harms emerge, and I am worried always about unintended or just badly intentioned use of this information. And I think we have reached a point where we just need some intervention. So, for example, we've seen cell phone carriers sell data to bounty hunters. We've seen app-based data bought through data brokers be used to publicly shame people into quitting, specifically a Catholic priest who was using apps that indicated he was homosexual. In 2000 or earlier this year, actually, Senator Ron Wyden sent letters to the FTC and the SEC kind of outlining how there was a location data broker that was selling the location data of people who were seeking reproductive health care directly to anti-abortion groups. And so these are all cases where, just having this information out there, making it available and selling it to particular people who are going to use it for things that really do very directly impact and in some cases challenge the physical safety of people is one way that that we're concerned about harms. And there, I've in the course of my 6 years here, I have filed a lot of information requests to data brokers. It's a mix of information, some of it publicly available, some of it quite granular, some of it true, some of it not true, some making inferences about things that I may have done. Before I was an advocate, I was a reporter. I would often look up and get down very deep rabbit holes on stuff that I was reporting on, but is not necessarily about my interests. Those sometimes show up in those reports. So there's a lot of just a lot of concerns that we have about sort of how all of those things can play out in people's daily lives. And then EFF also has concerns that data brokers have been used to circumvent our Fourth Amendment rights. So particularly selling information from mobile apps or cell phones, often again that track our movements pretty closely. Where you go says a lot about who you are, where you work, where you live, where you worship, where your children go to school, who you associate with. And so, we really do strongly believe that if this is information that the government would need a warrant, for example, to obtain themselves, they shouldn't be able to buy it on the market. So that's just a couple of the harms that we worry about most.
Thanks. Chris, what are the unintended consequences of laws that overly restrict the responsible use of data for advertising and marketing?
Great question, Bob. I'm going to go back to the professor's initial question and challenge challenge the question, Professor. An unregulated data broker community is simply not true. Data brokers and the use of data has been regulated in countless, well, not countless, but many, many ways over the last many decades. What you can use data for is really the question. You cannot use data to unduly or unlawfully discriminate under, the EEOC. You can look at the Driver's Privacy Protection Act. You can look at the Fair Credit Reporting Act. You can look at Fair Lending Acts. There are countless examples where we have strong federal laws that have been on the books for decades that regulate data brokers and what they can use data for. So when we talk about data, I think that, initially we really have to look not at what the data is, but what is the data being used for, and viewed under that lens, because privacy is subjective. There should be protections, but data used in one context should, maybe rightfully so outlawed, banned, made illegal. But that same data, piece of data, a data set, used in a different context may be perfectly viable, perfectly responsible to use and beneficial. So I think that how we look at the use of data, the role of data brokers in, the discussion, the broad discussion of privacy, is one that we have to take a look at. What is the data being used for? Now, Bob, to your question, I think the question is, why is it important, or what is the what is the harm in having multiple privacy laws?
No, the
Yeah.
unintended consequences
unintended.
of the overregulation.
Yeah, yeah.
Which probably Haley would disagree with. But,
Sure.
Of
Yeah.
data brokers.
The unintended consequences. Well, let's take the Delete My Data Act. You know, in California, we were engaged as the ANA on that bill. It sounds terrific. Look, I don't know who has my data, and California has a list, a registry of data brokers, and I just want a mechanism where I can tell them, delete it all. Get it all, get rid of it, delete it, never to come back. Well, we had talked earlier, I think, in the conversation about what happens when you lose your identity, right? Or it's stolen. The companies that aid in restoring or rectifying that or identifying you as who you are many times data brokers or data providers. If all of that data is gone, that is going to make it much more difficult for an individual to get back what has been taken or re-identify themselves. So that's one example. There's another example of the broad deletion of data. There's a law on the books now in California that allows in certain circumstances for data suppression. There are categories of people within California that can put themselves on a list and have their data suppressed, so made not public. It's a narrow categories of individuals in California, but that law's been on the books for, I don't know, at least a decade. And so when we are talking about wide swaths of deleting data from individuals, they may think they are doing the right thing, being responsible, taking doing the right thing by deleting all their data. Well, when they run into make a credit transaction, but there's no credit history, what happens if they want to put an offer on a house? There is no credit history. There's no, how do you, there are countless examples in which that data not being there is going to negatively impact that individual. I don't think the average Californian, where we've seen that that law pass once it's established, I don't know that the average California understands the potential unintended consequences of making that choice and having all of their data deleted. Moreover, on top of that, the unintended consequence of the cost. In our opinion, the state of California grossly underestimated how much it will cost to build and maintain the data structure, or just the structure to carry out these delete my data requests. We have an analog with the FTC in creating the TCPA, telemarketing database. Do not call list. Thank you, Mike. The do not call list was millions of dollars. And California thinks that, setting up this delete my data mechanism to be going live in 2026 is going to be a fraction of what it cost the FTC years ago to build. This is eminently more complicated. And we think it's going to cost the state of California a tremendous larger sum than what they've estimated.
Chris, I have an idea for you.
Oh, here you go.
Hello? Back. Back. How about a movie with Tom Cruise who pushes the delete button and any number of ways to capture the popular attention?
Hey, Bob, you wanna fund that?
Well,
I
think the ANA is probably
maybe we should get some
rolling.
advertisers. Yeah, no. We're our friends from the Motion Picture Association.
Thanks. Haley, how did the Delete Act come to be in California, and what has happened since the Delete Act passed? One quick note on regulatory costs. The new microplastic regulations for the water industry are going to be tremendously costly and in a very compressed time. So Haley, please, about the how the Delete Act came to be.
Sure. So the Delete Act, builds on a broader trend that we're seeing that others have mentioned about increased consumer data privacy legislation that we've seen I think, again, I've been here about 6 years. Before that, I was at Washington Post for 8 years. I think we've seen a lot of frustration from folks about a lack of movement on data privacy legislation at the federal level. Certainly when I was a baby reporter in 2011, I was told it was definitely the year that we were going to get consumer privacy legislation. That has not happened yet. So I think overall, we've been seeing this sort of push from states just kind of saying, like, what can we do on privacy? In terms of the Delete Act specifically, there is a federal bill that is the Delete Act. And when we were all sort of looking at many of the California privacy groups talk to each other, as you might imagine, when Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, which is really the civil society group that was behind this bill, they have done a lot of work on data breaches, for example, as well as a lot of other privacy issues. When they were considering legislation to pursue, Delete Act was one of the ideas that came up. And, sort of alluding to my earlier comments, one way that we think privacy laws, particularly the California Consumer Privacy Act, could be stronger is to make things less onerous for individuals. Again, because often when we're thinking about data brokers, these are companies that often people have no idea that have their information. And so that is why we want, overall, we want tools that can basically let people send broad signals to express their choices if they want to make a broad decision. And so in California, we have both the CCPA and the Data Broker Registry. So we had those two pieces of existing law to build on, as well as, I said, a technically competent, politically savvy agency in the form of the California Privacy Protection Agency. And so from what I understand, PRC worked very closely with the agency to kind of talk through, okay, if you did get implementation of this, how would that work? How would you approach it? And so, had backing from the agency to work together on sort of what this would look like in the future. And then, we helped build broad support for the bill. If you look at the analyses online of the bill, we had economic justice, legal aid, reproductive justice, privacy groups, all in support, as well as the California Attorney General. Since the bill passed, obviously it was quite recent, and the requirement to establish the mechanism, I think the bill requires the agency to establish an accessible mechanism by January 1st, 2026. So we're not there yet. But we are, of course, seeing discussion of how they're going to implement. There was a bill introduced earlier in this session that in our minds would have weakened the provisions of the bill quite significantly, but that bill has foundered and, as far as I know, is not moving forward. So things seem to be fairly on track. And I think, again, I think this really tapped into some broad frustration about privacy. And that is one reason that we were able to build a broad base of people to support the bill.
Under HIPAA, you have to be able to track 7 years of the movement of any personally identifiable health data. So it's not the exact same thing, but that I'm wondering how many people actually opt into that to find out what's been going on with the data and what the costs have been involved. But I suspect both parties could get something out of that for that issue. Mike, what are the current trend lines among the states that have enacted omnibus privacy legislation, and is their majority model emerging?
Right, and I'll just add it. There's 1,000 sides to every story, and the passage of the Delete Act, I think there's been some broader coverage about some other players that had been in the mix, particularly those with an interest for-profit authorized agent work. What I mean by that is third parties having assigned to them the right to effectuate consumer rights on their behalf. And we've seen some that were behind that effort fund other enterprises, in particular in the state of New Jersey, who have activated this right under another law to seek non-disclosure rights and followed up with lawsuits. And I think I note that because it's an issue that should be addressed in California. It must be addressed with the federal legislation as that's moving forward to make sure that any rights request is really being done by the individual whose rights are subject or data is subject to those rights, particularly when we start having a private right of action in play and making sure that those requests are authorized by individuals and not assigned some way, and not abused by the trial bar. I sidetracked there because your question about what are the trends and what is the majority approach. I don't think there is necessarily a majority approach. We're seeing certainly omnibus efforts, omnibus privacy laws, and there's some trends there, but there's a lot of discrete laws. I don't know if you want to call them cottage industry laws, but there does seem to be focus on discrete issues, whether it's consumer health data, where we've seen Washington, Connecticut, Nevada pass laws around consumer health, and other states introduce like legislation protecting consumer health data. For many of the issues that Haley raised, where it's meant to protect individuals' consumer health information, seeking reproductive rights, all I think issues that many of us care about and want to see protected. There are other areas around certain disclosures for certain classes of people that are also now having laws that are being developed. We could spend 2 hours talking about the trends, but to bring us back probably to the conversation, the omnibus privacy laws, I think that there are 3 stages that we could look at, 3 errors if you want, in a short 6-year period. There's California. That was the first mover that set out a certain set of rights, notices, opt-out for advertising, behavioral advertising, sales sharing, however you want to define it. Then there was everybody else. No other state followed California directly. We saw a version of new privacy rights, new requirements that started in Washington that were eventually adopted in Colorado, Connecticut, and a version similar in Virginia, then Montana, Tennessee, Florida, and it just continued to populate from that. We've now seen a new sort of era of privacy legislation following movements in Congress trying to adopt a prior bill called the ADPPA. Those have not been successful so far, particularly in the New England area. Those have fallen, but there's still now efforts looking to the APRA as the model in states. The essence of all these, though, are about providing a certain set of consumer rights: access, opt out for sales, sharing, certain transfers, correction, portability, deletion. That's the heart, that's the trend. But there's not great uniformity from state to state, which my sense is we're going to get to the patchwork next and what those complications are. And there are some real material differences, which are only going to get worse as additional states move away from that base.
Here, the FTC reached a groundbreaking settlement with Epic Games over Fortnite's privacy practices. The scope wasn't just to under 13, but also teens. What are the lessons to take away from this action, and what might we expect in the future from the FTC?
Sure. And I might zoom out a little bit and say consumer protection by definition is reactive, right? There is an injury, there is a harm that regulators see, and there's a response to it. I mean, that's in many ways what the state privacy laws have done. And if you think post-COVID, teen mental health was in the news nonstop, a lot of cyberbullying, a lot of depression. And Epic, I think, is a really good example of the priority, the FTC, and honestly, we're hearing it from state attorneys general as well, that teens also need to be protected, and that consumer protection laws, there's COPPA, which is the federal law protecting under 13 children's online privacy, but that teenagers also deserve protection and were harmed by some of the settings or the lack of settings or the default settings, and it being a big discussion. And as a result of the product, the games, default settings, the company was engaged in unfair practices towards those teenagers and entered a settlement where it had to make some different choices in terms of product design. And I think that is a theme that we are seeing in current enforcement efforts with state attorneys general, really looking at teen privacy. And are companies doing enough to protect that? And for a lot of organizations, they know how to deal with COPPA. in terms of whether their website or product or game is a general audience under the COPPA standard, or might it be directed to children, or do they have actual knowledge of children? But we've seen this push with California Age Appropriate Design Code Act, Maryland Age Appropriate Design Code Act, that companies need to do more. It's not enough to age gate if you come to the website and answer a trick question on your age, but that companies have an obligation to do more, whether they have teenagers. How are the teenagers using their digital properties, and really being thoughtful about the design settings, engagement, but peer-to-peer, and whether there's foreseeable harm that needs to be mitigated and addressed in a reasonable way. And so FTC settlements, like state AG settlements, the goalposts move with every enforcement, and we are to interpret from those enforcement examples how the regulators interpret the laws, and really take that back and reflect, how does that apply to your business practices? What changes might be appropriate to take into account?
Thanks, Alyssa. Chris, what impact is the growing patchwork of state privacy laws having on American consumers, business, and nonprofits? This is something that financial institutions have dealt with for many years, but now it seems to be getting even broader.
So it's a good question, because, again, going back to my sort of overarching comment of privacy and what is the data being used for it's intertwined here. And the unintended consequence of having a patchwork is, number one, it's not good for the American, the individual consumer, the individual citizen in this country. If you believe that privacy is a right, or is a public imperative, then whether you live in California or Michigan or Virginia or Washington, D.C. shouldn't matter. We should have a national standard by which companies and others must abide. It just makes sense, especially in the online context, because we are talking about the internet, which is global. So that's sort of the idealistic answer. But more practically, having multiple state laws, these omnibus laws that Mike alluded to and Alyssa mentioned, it's really expensive for companies to comply. Money is being, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, let's be honest, millions of dollars being spent on really good attorneys like Alyssa and Mike Signorelli and their law firms to comply with these disparate laws, which that money could very well be better spent in developing privacy protective technologies, really going to mitigate some of the concerns that data may bring. So there's another practical economic reason for a national standard. But a national standard has to not only protect individuals' privacy, but it also has to be workable for American business to be able to implement. And we don't want to throw the golden goose out that's been spitting out golden eggs for the last 20, 25, 30 years with the responsible use of data. Advertising and marketing is responsible for $7.1 trillion and 28.5 million jobs in this country. And that's from a study, an independent study done in 2020. We're 4 years later. It's even larger now. One of the things that, as we look at the patchwork, the how to comply with different laws for companies, well, I've got to do this for this state, I got to do that for that state. This data is okay, that data is not okay. That also becomes problematic and costly. And again, going back to the unintended consequences, we can talk about different states' approaches in the federal government proposals on sensitive data. Let's take age, for example. There are proposals out there that would raise the age restriction of COPPA from under 13 to under 18. So now we're capturing 14-year-olds, 17-year-olds, where we have these young Americans who are getting their first jobs, earning their first taste of disposable income, and they are part of the economy. More to the point, we're treating a 17-year-old who is on the cusp of majority and who is making decisions about their future, about which college am I going to go to? Should I apply to George Mason? Maybe the military is right for me, or what about a trade? What else can I do once I'm out of high school? And some of these proposals would take data out of the milieu where they can learn about those experiences. That's an unintended consequence of treating a 17-year-old as we do a 7-year-old. It's not necessarily in the best interest of that 17-year-old. And going back to the previous panel, the age as a discriminator for what's appropriate or not is not necessarily the right measure in my estimation. One of the other aspects too, and we've seen this in the States, regarding sensitive information, and again, going back to, it's not the data, it's what it's being used for. Let's say I am opening up a kosher deli or a halal deli, what have you, and I've got the best, let's call it the best Reuben sandwich on the menu in my town. I'm a small business. I don't have a lot of money to get the word out about my new deli, but if it's a kosher deli, where am I going to initially go? Where am I going to spend my $10,000 to get those first customers in the door? I'm going to look for data that aligns with those that keep kosher, right? That data is restricted. You can't use it for advertising or marketing in Virginia. And yet that data, sure, it can be sensitive in another context, but here, that kosher keeping customer is not going to know about my deli. They're not going to know about my great Reuben sandwich because of the overly prescriptive law in Virginia as it's applied. So it's one of those things, again, unintended consequences. It's not the data. What are you using the data for? Which is really, in my estimation, at the nub of the privacy debate.
So it's interesting. A lot of this discussion from all the panelists is about state, federal, and patchwork. I think people recognize patchworks are probably not great. That's why they're called patchworks. But the last time around, when we were going to have a privacy push in Congress, California said, great, let's have a national law, except I can have tougher laws than than the federal law. And it sort of ran aground in the entrance of San Francisco Harbor, I believe, Haley. It seems like we keep going around this circle over and over again.
Thanks. Perhaps one more question, then a question or two from the audience, and then closing statements. Mike, what impact would a do not collect requirement have on market and service offerings? Actually, before that, is there anyone that thinks a patchwork of state laws is good or helpful?
No.
I mean, you've encouraged me to unmute. I mean, I do. Obviously, I would like to see strong privacy protections for everyone in the country. I do think, you referenced the sort of what the preemption debate, right, around the national privacy law. I mean, there are a lot of cases in which we have a national standard upon which states can build, particularly in privacy. Health privacy comes to mind. The concern that I have is that states have clearly shown that they have built consensus, that they have debated over policy to achieve the laws that they have passed. And the last thing that I would want to see is for people to roll back protections in states that have passed for something weaker at the national standard. So I don't oppose having a national standard, but I don't want to see it override protections that states have decided are right for the people in their own states. I wouldn't want to see that weakened at all. And there are definitely models that even in privacy that we can point to where that is, where states have the ability to build on top of a basic federal law. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Haley. And Mike, what impact would do not collect requirement have on the market and service offerings?
I think it's important to reflect that data is not local. We operate in a global economy, and we need to stay in line or ahead of our competitors around the world. And to do so, we need to have a national standard. and to ensure that consumers have equal rights no matter where they live, and that businesses can operate in a way to serve their customers, provide products and services, we need a national standard. We could set a national standard with reasonable standards that protect consumers, that promote innovation. And we have seen a national consensus among the states that have enacted legislation that can be ported, and things would need to be added, things would need to be changed, but we have a place to start. And allowing for 50 different privacy regulations is just not workable, and it won't end. It'll just continue to evolve over time, further fragmenting the market and changing rights for consumers. In an area where that's acute is putting limits on the collection of data. That is not a new concept. We have seen this in the policy debate. I've seen it many times over in the last 20 years. And each time there's a realization that it's not about the collection, it's about the use. Putting limits and controls around particular uses of data, not saying you can't collect, stopping the data at the front door, because that's impossible to stop the collection, but you could put restrictions on particular uses. And by having a complete no collection rule without any exceptions, is that we lose many of the vital services and products where we started the conversation. Data brokers provide vital services for fraud prevention, for security, for maintaining online transactions, for identity purposes. I mean, there's a long list of valuable services that rely on data. And if you remove those don't exist anymore. And you can't rely on your own in-house resources to do that because they're not at the scale. And the reason why you're going out to check to make sure that the person that wants to buy from you online is the person they say they are, you're going to a third-party source that can validate that for you because you don't have that data in-house. It's a new customer. How do you know that you're going to ship a new pair of Nikes to somebody without checking whether or not they're a valid person? And you need someone that can do that for you.
Thanks. Anyone have any questions for this eminent panel? I see a hand. Jerry.
And then Marilyn.
So I really liked the focus on use. I always like to hear that. And I was hoping something that you said, Bob and Chris, and it's not an easy question, but it might have some easy answers. What are data uses that are not illegal or regulated now and should be criminalized, right? So we all agree, we know those when we see them. Are there any that, especially the pro-business members of the panel, say, you know what, this should be criminalized, this usage, not ban the collection, but if you do this, because I always think about, well, character, reputation, and fitness, right? For 20 years, we've been going, gosh, FCRA is really broad. Be cautious. You could have liability there. Are there use cases? Because we're hearing a whole lot of, well, gosh, there ought to be a law. Are there any examples where this use should be criminalized and it isn't now by some law that all these experts are familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example, Mike. I'll let you talk about that. But I think that in recent years, we have seen some restrictions on that use of data for doxing, for example. That's again use of data for individual harm. I think that we've looked at some of the location data for particular areas, but I will tee my colleague up, Mike Signorelli here. It's something about 6 years ago, the ANA, along with Venable, a lot of our members and others in the advertising industry, created a coalition called Privacy for America. And the goal was to create a standard or example for specific privacy restrictions, and something that Congress could take a look at and use as inspiration for a national privacy law. Mike can walk through, maybe some of the details, but yeah, there are examples, I think, where in the Privacy for America rubric, there are red light, yellow light, and green light sort of uses of data, of things that are red light, just data should not be used for these purposes. Yellow light, maybe restrictive, maybe an opt-in standard, maybe supervised or with strong FTC oversight or engagement than green light purposes, which really are not harmful. So, yeah, well, criminal, right?
And that was the Jerry. I'm glad you pointed that out, because that was the area that I was going to immediately jump on. I don't know if, in the context of what we've been talking about, there's a tremendous amount of data uses that should be criminalized, because criminal liability is much different than civil liability, and there are areas that there are probably more in the civil space. On the criminal side, the Privacy for America actually identified certain uses of data that should be strictly prohibited and things that are legal. I think Chris had already mentioned the use of data for making legal determinations for credit, employment, housing, academics, doing so in a way that is in violation of existing laws like the lending laws and equal opportunity employment laws, things like that. But procuring data for the purpose of perpetuating fraud is not actually illegal. That's something that Privacy for America identified and saying, if you're collecting data to commit fraud, like that should be an add-on violation. And if you do so under false pretense to source that from data brokers, that as well should be illegal. So there are areas where there probably can be criminal liability using data to stalk people, to cause physical harm to them, things like that could be another add-on violation in the criminal space. Yeah, I think maybe Haley might point out that some of that may already be happening. And so there might be probably more commonality and grounding between the two of us on some of these, because some of the examples Haley provided included the use of data to cause someone actual harm. So I don't know how hypothetical it is, but it's certainly not widespread. I think that's harming, but the data part would be new.
Okay. All right.
Procuring data for it.
Thank you. And with the last question, Marilyn, please.
So we've talked a lot. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
We've talked a lot today about standardization of data and the uses of data. Could you talk, I'm not sure which one of you or all of you should talk about this, but could you talk about the protection of data? Because I don't want to give anybody my data, and maybe if I understood a little bit more, not only what they were using it for, but how they were protecting it, instead of reading about breaches, which I've just been involved in every single day, that would help me to trust and to want to give my data. Thank you.
I'll chime in and just simply say that you would be amazed at how little data advertisers and marketers actually use to try to deliver a message about that right product or right service at the right time through the right channel to you is, and how quickly that data goes actually stale. A lot of the data that is at the root of identity theft or was breached or hacked or what have you, is advertising and marketing data it's generally not. But that said, we talk about a patchwork. We have a national patchwork of data breach notification laws, and I was there to see the patchwork stitched together. All 49 states, I think, actually have it. But it's one of those things where eventually companies, it all sort of gets homogenized, and companies go to the least common denominator and say, okay, this is the toughest law, and that becomes the de facto law as far as notifying individuals if a breach has occurred. Preventing. Yeah. It's a good question. I am not a cybersecurity expert, but I will say there are you have very, very successful companies that are out there fighting every day those threats to get in and to get your data. Really smart companies. And I think a few years ago, Mike, we have a member, I think a client of yours, that said, guess how many, cybersecurity attacks we thwart every day. And this was years ago. It's somewhere in the nation, in the neighborhood of 30 trillion attempts a day. 30 trillion. That's bananas.
I think there's it's an important part of the data story, securing that information. The preventive measures taken by companies do not get the headlines. The breaches do, obviously, but companies spend time and resources mitigating, planning. There's a lot of great work being done in this space. In fact, NIST, government agency, has been a leader working with industry to set forward a framework for companies to test their cybersecurity, their readiness. I could tell you there's a lot that happens with reputable companies, responsible companies that invest a lot of money to make sure that their data is secure.
I have a last quick question, and then we'll have the roundup. So New York State has a fairly recent law for financial services requiring a chief information security officer for a financial services company over a certain size. What do you think that type of law might be applicable or helpful to the data brokerage industry related to Maryland's question?
I think standalone, no. I think, though, any robust program has a point person responsible for reviewing your program, ensuring it's compliant with law, mitigating risks to data. So I think most proposals that we're seeing come through Congress would have some sort of security and privacy program requirement where there is somebody ultimately responsible for carrying that out.
And one other quick question. In quite a few industries, the insurance is driving cybersecurity and cybersecurity standards and approaches. Is that true in data brokerage also? Requirements from the insurance companies for cyber and privacy insurance driving the actual practices? Yeah, well, maybe not then. Yeah, maybe not. Yeah.
It's part of the data.
Okay, well, thank you, Marilyn. Marilyn has both personal and professional insight, having been CIO at George Mason and MIT. So thank you. With that, we'll have thank you for the wonderful discussion. And so with that, we'll have the closing remarks for everyone. And perhaps we can start online with Haley and Alyssa, and then here with Mike and Chris. So Haley, please.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me here and letting me be the skunk at the garden party in some ways. So I do appreciate that, and for letting me speak. I do think that I take a lot of your points to heart, and I do think that we do think a lot about use and versus collection. I think the thing that has been frustrating for consumers is that once the information is collected and they don't know it's collected, and they have no way of finding out what the uses are, so they can't consent to that. So I think, definitely more conversations to be had. I really appreciate your perspectives, and thanks for having me here.
Thanks, Haley. Alyssa.
I think we're still in early days, but there's a bright spotlight on privacy and data uses. And so it brought more stakeholders into talking about what uses do we think are okay? What uses need more protections or more curbs? The data supply chain. Do we need more trust and safety and accountability measures, know your customer type of diligence and auditing? And so as we talk about more uses, we bring more of the insights in from stakeholders. I do think we are going to get to commonplace standards, but we're still in early days. And so you're going to have opportunities by those who want to be leaders and really lead to develop the framework there, and those who are going to come at it kicking and screaming. And so, it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Thank you, Mike.
I'm optimistic that we've got an opportunity right now to actually pass a national preemptive privacy law, and I'm excited about it. I know there's a lot of work right now happening in both the House and Senate. There's great committed staff in both chambers on both sides of the Republican and Democrat parties working hard. I think we're probably closer. And I felt like I'm on one side, Haley was on the other. I feel like we're probably closer than it seemed today. And I think if we all came to the table, we could actually get this done this year.
Thank you. And Chris?
So thanks again for having us and for a great conversation, and thanks to my panelists. I'll just simply say that, again, advertising and marketing and the responsible use of data has, in the last a couple of decades, launched this country in its technological development, as well as the democratization of content, for good and for ill. But we would not have the life we have, the digital life we have, had it not been for companies and advertising to underwrite these developments. I think that as we, continue to address the sticky questions and difficult questions on what is the right balance of the responsible use of data and privacy, I think like Mike, I'm optimistic that we'll find the right balance. But I think that we need to be cognizant that we don't want to stifle the innovation that is brought by new technology that just happens to be supported and underwritten by advertising and marketing. And again, the benefit that individual Americans have through responsible data-driven marketing has fostered countless bloggers. It is supporting, podcasters, individual businesses out of people's homes, because they can identify that right audience that is interested in their product or their content at the right time through the right channel. And it has, made our lives better.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you all for joining, and for those online for joining. I'd like to turn it over to Bob for the closing. And many thanks to Bob for conceptualizing and organizing the day.
Well, I really, first of all, a shout out to all of you who have been here through the whole thing. I hope you got a lot out of it. I know I did, and we appreciate the online audience, and we are thinking about doing this again next year. So who knows? By that time, we may have a series of Supreme Court decisions, and state legislatures will churning away, and maybe there'll be a national privacy bill. So who knows? And I really appreciate all four of these panel members. I think this has been very informative and really, I think, terrific. So wish you guys all a great day, and best things for everyone in the future. Thank you.
Thank you all.